Hello everyone, welcome to my video series on Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games. The purpose of this video series is to provide the opportunity to look at Fischer's own annotations in his My 60 Memorable Games and see some of those annotations and variations in practice. One of the greatest chess teachers of all time was the world correspondence champion Purdy. And Purdy suggested that the primary and best way to get better at chess was to play over dozens, hundreds, thousands of master games, and to go a move at a time, to then make a move, usually for the winning side, and then to check to see whether or not your move matches the next move from the winning side, and to do this over and over and over again. That is why when I include uh, Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games in my Lichess study, I don't have the annotations already on the screen. I want players to have that Purdy opportunity to go through the game a move at a time, and then after playing Guess the Move with the games, to then look through it and then see how their own moves match up, how their own moves maybe match up with computer analysis, and also to see what the general plans and ideas are. And I think this is the best way to work through it. So if you haven't already gone through the game slowly and gone a move at a time, not looking at the moves ahead of time, trying to figure out Fischer's plans during the game ahead of time, I want to really suggest you do that, because that is a way to get stronger. But if you have already gone through the game and seen what it's about, then I welcome you to watch the rest of this video. So let me start by reading the Larry Evans introduction to this first game. This first game was played in the New Jersey Open Championship in 1957 by a 14-year-old Bobby Fischer. When he was 14, Fischer would also win the U.S. Championship for the first time, and his next year at age 15, he would become the world's youngest grandmaster. That is a record that he would hold for several decades. And of course, there have been numerous great child prodigies in chess. Paul Morphy was world elite by the time he was 13. Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin, who are both either world champion or world champion challengers, they were grandmaster strength by the time they were, later 12. Magnus was a grandmaster when he was 13. Karjakin wasn't even 13 yet when they became grandmasters. So Fischer becoming a grandmaster at 15, U.S. champion at 14, truly extraordinary. And this first game in 1957 of his memorable games, it's interesting he chooses this one. He does not annotate his very famous childhood game, which was against Donald Byrne in the third Rosenwall Memorial in 1956. That game has been called the game of the century. Fischer doesn't start with that one. He doesn't include that. In fact, all of Fischer's games in his My 60 Memorable Games come from the years 1957 to 1967, so some of his other more famous games are not in his collection as well. That includes some of his masterpieces against Petrosian in the Candidates Final, a couple of his games against Boris Spassky in 1972, etc. So this is the first game that Fischer annotates, and we will begin with Larry Evans' intro. To go through this game, it's probably going to take us several videos, because on my screencast I can only do about 15 minutes at a time, so just to let you know, it's going to take us a while to get through this whole thing. So Evans writes, although Sherwin makes no serious errors in the opening, he misses several equalizing opportunities, demonstrating the technical virtuosity that it is to become his hallmark. Fischer, with astonishing maturity, gradually strengthens his grip by accumulating small advantages, the better center and the two bishops. Sherwin, meanwhile, attempts to consolidate his position only to see his 14-year-old opponent shatter it with a thunderbolt. Knight takes h7. It brings to mind Alekhine's combinations, which also seem to spring from nowhere. Sherwin, lashing back, refuses to fall. However, his defense finally disintegrates under a series of acute blows to his wobbly king. Okay, Fischer begins the game with e4, which of course is by no means surprising. And Sherwin answers with c5, the Sicilian defense. Fischer plays knight f3, and Sherwin responds with e6. This can lead into numerous variations of the Sicilian, I think most notably the Taimanov Sicilian, but it can transpose into a lot of other versions of the Sicilian as well. The two other major primary moves in this position are the modern Sicilian, which is d6, and of course the old Sicilian, which is knight c6. And both of those are perfectly playable and were recently played in the World Chess Championship match between Carlsen and Caruana. But Sherwin plays e6, and here we now have a couple of interesting ideas. Fischer plays d3, and he writes, "This used to be my favorite. I thought it led to a favorable variation of the King's Indian reversed, particularly after black has committed himself with pawn to e6. Now, the main line in this position, of course, is the d4, which usually leads to this exchange in the center. But there's another idea that I thought would be worthy exploring, and I'll have to explore it some other time. But one of the games that I saw in the collection was a game between Veselin Topalov and Peter Leko, where Topalov actually plays c4 and goes for an early Marazzi bind. And what I really like about that early Marazzi bind is that you already have a stranglehold on the d5 square early on, and that game continues knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop e2, d5. Now, Peter Leko, who had the black pieces, defeated Topalov in this game, so I'm guessing it's not necessarily the best line, but I just think it's a very interesting alternative to look at. So by playing d3, Fischer is indicating he wants to go for a King's Indian attack kind of setup. By playing d3, he's demonstrating by fencing in his light squared bishop, he's demonstrating that he is going to be playing g3 and he is going to be fianchettoing his bishop. So Sherwin plays knight c6, then Fischer plays g3, knight f6, and then bishop g2. Fischer points out, though, in response to the knight f6 move, that he played another game that continued d5, knight bd2, bishop d6, bishop g2, knight ge7, castles, castles, knight h4, and white has chances for the initiative. That was from Fischer-Ivkov, Santa Monica, 1966. The Santa Monica 1996 tournament was the second Pigorsky Cup, which is one of the most important and famous chess tournaments ever held in the United States. Okay, let's go back to the line. So Sherwin plays knight f6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, castles, knight bd2. So when I was playing Guess the Move, when I was going over all these games, this was one of the first moves that I did not expect. I mean, I definitely saw it as a candidate move, but it was not a move that I expected because I was thinking to myself, doesn't this knight going to d2, doesn't it fence in the queen's bishop early? But that's not something that Fischer is particularly worried about now. He does have a long-term plan of what he's doing, and the knight being on d2, even though, okay, it temporarily cramps the bishop, that's not a long-term strategy. It's also important to note that the knight is not going there because Fischer is planning on fianchettoing the other bishop. To fianchetto both bishops in this position would be rather awkward. You would want this bishop to be free to go along this diagonal for coming attacks. So even though to me it seemed a little counterintuitive because it was blocking in the bishop, you have to remember that the King's Indian attack is a slower opening. The very fact that Fischer has decided to fianchetto his king's bishop, even though this pawn is on e4, which is temporarily fencing it in, this is not a opening that is looking for rapid open lines, but is rather building toward the center and building toward an eventual attack on the king side. So then Sherwin plays rook b8. I was surprised by this move. Fischer writes, Sherwin slid the rook with his pinky, as if to emphasize the cunning of this mysterious move. That is really strange, that Sherwin, who would become an international master, is moving the rook with his pinky, but I think Fischer is just having some fun, making fun of this passive move. So when I saw the move, I also was confused by it, because I was thinking to myself, well, what's the purpose? It seems passive. What does it possibly accomplish? But the only thing I could think about is that he simply wants the rook off the main light square diagonal. He's worried about potential tactics with the bishop on this main light square diagonal, and so he's looking to get out of the way of those early. Fischer, instead of rook b8, he recommends the following variation. He recommends d5, rook e1, b5, e5, knight d7, knight f1, e4, h4, a5, bishop f4, a4, a3. And then Fischer writes, this is how the game between him and Miag Mazarin in the Swiss Interzonal in 1967 says, it leads to a double-edged play where black's chances on the queen side countervail white's king side attack, but white usually comes first. So as you can see, my worries earlier about the fencing in of the dark square bishop, you can see how Fischer had planned to move the rook to reposition the knight, and the knight is going to then be going to h2 and then to g4 in the attack. So a lot of those worries that I had about the fencing in of the pieces, that's just part of the development of the long-term kingside attack that Fischer is looking for. But Sherwin plays rook b8, so we're back to that. And with that, I'm not sure how long I've been recording here, so I'm going to stop the video here, and we are going to continue after Sherwin's rook b8 in just a moment.